People don't have to love anything. They don't even have to like anything that I like, obviously. But when it comes down to it, Smallville is a series that I truly believe helped carry WB, a lot of DC comic superheroes, characters like that, and even some of these brands on television in live action for basically a decade. And yet, despite that, it's a show that constantly gets disrespect, whether that's from people looking back at it with, I would say, very, very cynical glasses, by looking at it and comparing it to things nowadays, or by the studio itself that actually owns these characters, WB, and by the rights holders who don't show respect to the people who made this show happen and who are trying to make more happen with it today. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to look at that. Obviously, I don't represent people like Tom Welling or Michael Rosenbaum or anybody who made and worked on Smallville, nor do I represent any studio. I look at things from two perspectives. One is that of a fan, a person who loves these characters, who they do mean something to, and one of whom is from the perspective of a creator, somebody who does create things myself, who does work on my own actual IP in my spare time, something I haven't really shared yet, maybe someday I will, someone who also works on creating YouTube videos. But I have really noticed that, especially from the corporate side of WB, there is a disrespect towards the things that got them to where they are and the people who got them to where they are. It also does kind of bleed into the fandom where people look back and compare things, but I want to look at both of those today. If you enjoy this video, leave a like, subscribe, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I do have a question of the day for you, which is, what is your favorite live action DC Comics show? And that's kind of where we get to the first point, which actually isn't only Smallville. It's also a show you may have heard of called Superman and Lois. Now, this is a show that's been going on for a few years now, and it was originally promised 7 seasons when people like Bitsy Tulloch came in and Tyler Hoechlin came in to actually make this show. They were promised essentially a 7-season run. But of course, now that show is being canceled. It's not actually reaching 7 seasons at all. It's being canceled multiple seasons early. I mean, it's done. And something interesting I thought about this is that it really does relate to Smallville and how Smallville has been treated over the years. Now, Smallville did get its entire tenure, but it got a lot of projects, including one right now that got ignored, not picked up, or just kind of disrespectedly written off by WB and by the rights holders. Now, with Superman and Lois, it becomes a complicated situation. The CW was acquired by Nexstar fully, I believe. So essentially, it's something where originally WB obviously had more of a stake in it, and before that, Smallville started out on WB as a network, then it went over to the CW. But with Superman and Lois, it's just been a CW thing that eventually got canned for several reasons. One of the listed reasons was actually that they didn't want any kind of Superman media eating into the potential profits of the James Gunn Superman movie. I'm not really sure that it was him at all, or Peter Safran, who even had a hand in canceling Superman and Lois. But it also doesn't really seem like they helped either. When Superman and Lois was canceled, and this will tie back into Smallville, it was something where people were kind of looking at it and saying, okay, well, maybe James Gunn and Peter Safran, who have said in interviews they're open to Elseworld stories, have said they want to see these different characters, that they would fight for that to maybe go somewhere else. Even though they were working on their own thing, they knew that fans loved that show. But unfortunately, there was no push. There was no push from anyone at WB, whether it be them or anyone else, for that show to live on. And that's something that currently Smallville is experiencing. That same kind of thing where you have a high quality, and even if you think the script was bad in a lot of episodes, sure. Even if you think that the CGI and SFX and stuff, you look back at it and you're like, some of that's rough, sure. That was a thing that was a quality show overall that I would say captured the heart of Clark Kent and of Superman, and did get viewers to connect with those characters for basically a decade. But you look at it now, and ever since I believe about 2021, like late 2021, early 2022, you actually had Tom Welling and Michael Rosenbaum, both stars of Smallville, working on an animated spin-off an animated revival, I should say, to bring back that show. And other than one very obvious example, Allison Mack, who was involved in all of that, I should say, alleged cult stuff, but really did go through the ringer on it, and I believe was serving time for it. Other than her, they pretty much got the whole cast back. They got people involved, it made progress, and there have been progress reports over the years when it comes to that revival. For example, they actually had a test poster and a test animation done, and there was a plan to bring back different characters as well, like even Lionel Luthor. Now, when talking to Screen Rant at Comic-Con Stockholm, Welling had actually talked about the animated revival and saying that it would pick up after the series finale of the live-action series. And he also did talk about how the test animation was complete. This was back in 2022, and a teaser poster was also complete for the pitch as well, saying, I think it'd be a fun idea. We already have the animation done. I don't know if Michael shared it already, but we have a poster for it. It's with the cast and Lionel looming behind them. And there were other people involved as well, with Michael Rosenbaum sharing in March of 2024 that the whole cast was ready to do it. They wanted to do it. But unfortunately, even though the fandom was interested in it, even though the original cast was interested in it, and even though James Gunn had said, hey, we are open to Elseworld stories, as of 2024, the disrespect kind of continued, with WB just not even bothering to call them back. They didn't bother to answer, they didn't bother to give them the thumbs up, nothing really at all. They just kind of blew them off. Welling even went on to reveal, saying, I'll tell you where it's at. We need Warner Bros. And DC to let us do it. We've got Al and Miles, who are very busy doing a TV show called Wednesday, but they created Smallville. They want to write it. We just need the go-ahead from DC and Warner Bros. Listen, this is a passion project. It's not going to be a blockbuster. It's for the fans. All the actors want to do the voices of the characters. We're all in. We just need them to let us use the property. Welling even went on to add, it's not a priority for them. It's like a not returning phone calls thing. And this is really unfortunate because this is something that WB is honestly known for at this point. And the reason that I don't blame people like James Gunn and Peter Safran specifically is because, one, I want to keep an open mind and see what they do. But two, I've also noticed that this is just how WB rolls. All the way back to Smallville Season 6, WB was actually promoting and helping Smallville exist, and they did seem to care about it. But going into Season 7, 8, 9, 10, when you get to kind of like 8, it was very clear that the budget was being cut down. Now, you can attribute that to the CW transition and say, well, that's on the CW. Yeah, WB, they have a portion of it, but it wasn't just on them to float the show at that point, even though it was their characters, right? It was airing on CW. So that's on CW to take care of. But again, it's another one of those things like Superman and Lois, where WB had the money, the leverage, and the power to kind of push that to get more, to squeeze more out of it, to give it more money, and they didn't. You know, it's something where like they just kind of let it fizzle out on the CW because it was no longer a priority to them, right? It was something that had floated that character in live action for many, many years. Now, I already know someone's getting their gotcha comment ready and they're gonna say, well, that's not true. There were Superman cartoons and there was the Lois and Clark Superman type show in the 90s for a few years. Yes, there were some things, mainly though in terms of live action, other than that Lois and Clark run for a few years, I believe in like 1993 to 7-ish off the top of my head, live action Superman was not being done. There was basically a 20-year gap almost between 1987's Superman 4 and of course Superman Returns in 2006, where Brandon Routh came back to kind of take over the reins of that role and embody the Christopher Reeve Superman. Now, you can think back, Christopher Reeve was obviously, unfortunately and tragically paralyzed. He did appear in Smallville as well, and apparently had a great time on the show, played a small role, and influenced and impacted people like Tom Welling. But that said, my point is that Smallville was largely responsible in that 20-ish years and a little bit beyond for keeping live-action Superman alive. Yeah, Dean Cain's Lois and Clark exists, And it's a fine show. I know people want to hate it now because they dislike Dean Cain because of his political views. I don't really think that impacts the quality of the show at all, no matter where you land. The show is fine. It's a good show. It's fun. But my point is that like Smallville came in, took this very seriously in an era where that show no longer existed. Superman movies were not being made, and it was largely responsible for introducing so many people to this character as a real life human being playing the character on screen, especially for a younger generation that hadn't maybe seen the Christopher Reeve movies, hadn't maybe watched the Dean Cain Lois and Clark show. You know, this was something very important to the character, and I think that doing things like not even giving a call back, it's very disrespectful and just kind of ridiculous. So Smallville's budget kind of got cut a little bit at a time, and it was pretty apparent that they were working with what they could and doing the best job they could with that. And then you get to today where all of these stars are pitching to bring it back and nobody really cares. You know, WB cared enough and DC cared enough about Smallville to milk it for comics, to allow comic books to be made, because comic books are cheap. They cost very little in overhead to make, and so you can still use those characters without having to throw any money at them. I love comic books, but that's very clearly not like a super respectful way to treat the series, right? To wean it off of any kind of respectable budget and then only kind of hit the point where comic books can be made. It's something we've unfortunately seen many times, but it's just frustrating to watch WB treat things that way. And that's where I think it really ties into the disrespect as well towards Superman and Lois from WB. Yeah, you can blame the CW. You can say it's Nexstar acquiring CW fully. You can say that, you know, the CW never wanted to spend as much money on these programs. Look at the Arrowverse's budget. And you can even say things like, well, CW moved away from all of these different scripted TV shows, and they very clearly were getting rid of it. The writing is on the wall. But WB, it's still their characters. It's still Warner Bros. Discovery's characters that they are allowed to shop out, that they are allowed to push, that they are allowed to find a new home for. But instead, they kind of looked at it as, well, you got your 4 seasons. Oh, you were supposed to get 7? Well, you got 4. We're getting a new movie anyway. We got a use for Superman. Tyler, you've had the reins long enough. You did some Arrowverse stuff. You got 4 seasons. Why don't you go on your merry way? And it's just unfortunate because it does also feel like how they've been treating Smallville, where it's genuinely kind of frustrating and disrespectful to not even answer the calls of people who helped these characters remain relevant for a decade. Now, you can look at this again and you can say, well, these aren't the same people who ran WB back then. Sure, but WB had the same attitude back then, the attitude of throw out what made the bridge to get us where we are. You know, you could build a golden bridge for WB executives. They will cross it and they will smile the whole way. But as soon as you want to step on it to follow them, they'll tear it out from under you and demolish it. It's very frustrating to watch how they've treated the people who have made things like DC Comics, WB characters, and brands successful over the years, and they've thrown them out. You even want to see another example of that? Look no farther than Man of Steel. Look no farther than the DCEU. Now, yes, the DCEU was certainly troubled. It had a lot of problems. But if you look at Henry Cavill, I don't think he himself was ever a problem when it came to Superman. Now, that doesn't mean you had to keep him to make a new Superman movie. That's not my argument. But I would say it's kind of disrespectful the way he was treated, where he was jerked back and forth around the character for many, many years. Now, it's entirely possible that that was unintentional and that it was just the biggest circumstance ever, but either way, it's very disrespectful. And that's something that WB is very good at. Now, unfortunately, when it comes down to it, WB isn't the only one who disrespects Smallville, who looks back at it, mocks it, kind of points at it as a stupid thing or a blemish on the history of Superman. It's frustrating to me when I talk about this series, and it's something I saw when I talked about the rejected ending. People can have their criticisms, and that's totally fine. They don't even have to like it. But I truly believe that the series deserves some respect for what it did. It's a series that for many, many years was the live-action representation of the Superman characters. For many, many years, it got people from teenagers to young adults to full adults into these characters. It was a gateway that made people interested in Superman. It was a gateway that introduced people to Clark Kent, that made him human and relatable to also an audience that otherwise might not have watched superhero shows at the time. You have to remember that even though nowadays everyone and their grandma is an MCU fan and knows who people like, Chris Hemsworth are, at the time when this was airing, the early 2000s, you were a nerd if you liked comic books. You were a nerd if you liked superheroes. You were the kind of person that people would pick on in school if you enjoyed these characters. And growing up alongside this version of Clark Kent, watching him mature into a young man, watching him learn what responsibility meant, what having power meant, what being a hero meant, those are things that meant a lot to a lot of people. These are things that were Superman to many different people, and that actually got them into other versions of the character. There are people going to the theaters who will go and see the new Superman movie in 2025 who wouldn't have seen it if Smallville didn't exist. That's something that I think people forget, even if you don't like the show, and that's fine. I think people forget the importance of it. And I don't think WB has ever really understood the importance of it. Maybe they did for a few years when they were willing to throw money at it before the CW transition, but even back then, there was actually planned spin-offs for Smallville. Do I think that all of these should have been made? Absolutely not. I think that some of these shows were completely unnecessary. But taking a very brief look at it, there were pitches for Aquaman, Blue Beetle, The Flash, even a Justice League and Metropolis and Supergirl spin-off all over the years and the 10-season run of Smallville. But guess how many of those got picked up? Guess how many of those they were interested in expanding and doing something with? The answer would be a big fat zero. And now in late 2024, you have people like Tom Welling and Michael Rosenbaum who are really good actors, who have a lot of experience under their belt, not just in acting, but in other aspects of the entertainment industry, who are ready and willing to bring back this cast, who have test animations done, posters done, who have pitched it, and the studio doesn't even care to call them back. Now, I truly hope, talking about this, that people will be able to look back at this in 3 to 5 years, the animated revival will exist, and we can all just say, what a dumb, lapse of judgment for WB, glad they came to their senses. But overall, it's frustrating to me to watch people who care about these characters as much as I do, and I know they do because I've watched their podcasts, I've listened to their interviews. They care about these characters, they want the best for them, be ignored. Even though WB Studios, DC Studios I should say, and WB as rights holders are supposedly open to Elseworld stories, yet they're not open to more Smallville, they're not open to more of the DCAU. They ignored when the original cast got together and said they wanted to make more. They just basically said, shut up, get out of here. Now still aren't interested in it, with James Gunn saying it would basically just be copying Marvel. And then you have things like this, where they're just not interested in carrying, Superman and Lois or Smallville continuing in any way. It's just truly frustrating because these are all projects from people that I can tell truly care, and yet they can't get made. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. I will be interested to hear your thoughts about all of it. Again, even if you don't like the show, I don't care. I truly couldn't care less if somebody doesn't like this show. I just think it deserves respect for what it did for Superman and the DC Comics mythos. But that said, interested to see your thoughts down there. If you want to support this channel, we have things like a Fortnite code. We have other channels like JayRPG, where I cover role-playing games, Degenerate Plays, where we play through games together, podcast style, and anime channel, Magical Jill. All of those are in the description. We also have our own store, CosmoBunny.shop, where we actually make our own art out of repurposed, recycled comic book, manga, magazine, and more paper. A lot of this is damaged books that were going to landfills, being thrown out. What we do is we take these, we actually transform them, saving some of that paper, turning it into something new through resin coasters, keychains, trays, and more. Use code DJAY123 for 10% off your first purchase. Appreciate you very much. Have a fantastic day. And as always, everyone, stay shway.